All right, we're going to be doing the multiplication and division rules for integers. I don't want people to mix this up with the addition and subtraction of integers, which is another video that's posted on this channel. But that you do with what's called the scoreboard, okay? And what happens is the multiplication and division rules, a lot of times we'll mix that up with the addition and subtraction. So I will talk about how to tell the two apart in a moment, but let's talk about one thing, which is this big question, which is why is a negative times a negative a positive? So in explaining this, I will go through all of the multiplication and division rules. So let's start off with a real simple equation that's not going to seem shocking at all. 1 times 1, which is 1, okay? And what that shows is that's called the identity property. And what the identity property means is anytime you multiply something times 1, you get whatever you're multiplying. Okay? Not a shocker. You should be familiar with that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply this by negative 1. So I'm taking the same expression here, but I'm going to change this so what I've got is a minus here. Okay? So what that means is the opposite of. And you can see the effect that has. Okay? So basically what happens is whenever you multiply something by a negative 1, you get the opposite. So the opposite of this is negative 1. Okay? So that's what think of the negative sign as meaning the opposite of. In fact, sometimes when you look at a number, you can say that when you read the number. You can say this is the opposite of 1, so it's negative 1. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this equation right here and I'm just going to switch this part around, which you can do. You should know from multiplying stuff that you can do what I just did. That's called the commutative property. Okay? The commutative property says basically if I change the order of the numbers that I'm multiplying, the product is going to stay the same. And you can see that that's exactly what happened. I just took these two and switched it. So let's kind of like stop for a moment and see what rules we have. So what we've got here is this one here shows that a positive times a positive is equal to a positive. This one shows us that a negative times a positive is equal to a negative. And this one here shows us that a positive times a negative equals a negative. So then we get to the last one, which is I do this. Okay, so here's negative 1. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this. Now we learned back here that when you multiply something by negative 1, you get the opposite. So if I take this 1 and multiply it by that negative 1, I get a negative 1. Well, wouldn't it only then hold true that this negative 1 times the opposite turns it into the positive? Okay, so that proves that a negative times a negative is equal to a positive. And what we have right here in this column is those are the multiplication and division rules for integers. So, you know, some people might say, well, this is all with ones. Does it work with everything else? Well, of course it does. If you have 3 times 4, they're both positive. I get 12. If I do negative 3 times 4, so what happens is the minute I throw this opposite thing in here, because that's what it means, the opposite, has the same result. If I switch things around, I'm still going to get the same thing. And then of course if I add another opposite into the mix, for the same reason, I'll get a positive. Okay, so those are the multiplication and division rules. But before we finish this video out, I want to talk a little bit about division. Okay, because people go, well, you know, you've multiplied here, but what about division? Do the rules work for division? Absolutely. As I pointed out with the adding and subtracting of integers video on this channel, I find that division is confusing to people just because they're looking at it wrong. What division is kind of well, this might sound crazy, but I usually will tell the kids that there's no such thing as division. What you're doing is you're actually multiplying. So let's say I have a real simple problem like this, 15 divided by 3. Okay, well, 15 divided by 3 is actually the same thing as 15 times 1/3. Now there's another video on this channel called multiplying a whole number by a fraction. You might want to watch that to see how this works, but basically 15 divided by 3 is 5. But you can see I took this and rewrote it like this, so I'm actually multiplying. So if I'm multiplying, then the same rules I just went over would apply here. So if you have, say, negative 18 divided by 3, well, that's the same thing as negative 18 times 1/3. So that's a negative times a positive, which we know is a negative answer. So 18 divided by 3 here is negative 6. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is, with division, is I can write negative 18 divided by 3, which is actually symbolically another way to write division, is it's just a fraction. But if we look at this fraction, it just means negative 6. Because you have, because if you look, this is a negative number here, and this is a negative number, so they're the same thing. So these positive and positive, negative, positive, positive, negative, negative and negative, it also applies to division. That's why these are the multiplication and the division rules, because division is just basically another type of multiplication. It's multiplication in reverse. So those are the multiplication division rules of integer.